Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. I spoke with a witness and subsequent researcher who saw a Sasquatch one afternoon, in May of 2015. He was hunting for morel mushrooms in southwest Wisconsin. It occurred in an ecosystem often referred to as the Driftless. The term Driftless Area is used to refer to an area in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Illinois, and Iowa that was spared from the last glacial event that flattened the land to either side of it. It is hallmarked by dissecting river valleys, plateaus, bedrock, ridgelines, springs, and cave systems, making the area unique and distinct from even nearby habitat. The witness and subsequent researcher has a channel on YouTube called Driftless Area Sasquatch. He told me he refuses to go to another job interview wherein he was interrogated about his Bigfoot affiliations. So for the purpose of this investigation, I'll call him Driftless. Though Driftless's first definitive sighting occurred in 2015, knowing what he knows now, he believes his first experience occurred in 2005, though he didn't know it at the time. He was living with his then-wife, and he loved hiking through the Driftless. He lived in northern Wisconsin for all his younger life, and the Driftless area's terrain stood in stark contrast to the pine savannas, wetland, and glacial lakes that hallmark the north of the state. On that evening in 2005, Driftless was looking for morels. Having no luck where meager footpaths exist, he went a little further in. It wasn't long before he heard what at the time he thought was a coyote. He said it was very repetitive. It would be quiet for a while, and then begin again. It would make 3 or 4 evenly timed whistling howls. He didn't think much of what he calls the whistling howls. Coyotes can make all sorts of sounds, but this sounded extremely shrill and methodical, almost bird-like. But by the virtue of the volume and voice, he decided it was not a bird and must have been a larger mammal, and that's why he settled on coyote. Indeed, he couldn't help but notice that as he moved for hours, the shrieks seemed equidistant from him. As he traversed the slopes, the crier seemed to keep pace, which he found unnerving. But of course, he is still thinking, unnerving because he's being stalked by a coyote that obviously is not right in the head. This is still a place where brazen animal behavior is not tolerated. After another hour of this game, as Driftless was beginning to think of it as, it sounded, at least, as if it were getting closer. It seemed to close the gap. I can attest that it is simply impossible to move quietly on the slopes of the Driftless. Also for me it became quite apparent at how easily something could be within earshot, but out of sight. Again, as he was moving he would hear rustling, so he would stop, and then a moment later the rustling would stop too. And the sound always came from just where he was. Mountain lion did cross his mind at this point. Something was stalking him, that was certain in his mind. Probably a coyote, maybe a mountain lion. He wasn't armed. Were he back in his home turf up north, he certainly would have been armed. But at the time, he felt the need to be armed in southwest Wisconsin was a joke. I asked him how he could keep on traipsing around for mushrooms, thinking he is possibly being stalked by a mountain lion. He shrugged. He said, "You'll walk away from most mountain lion attacks, as long as you put up a hell of a fight." I won't even get into whether or not mountain lions inhabit the area, because the answer depends on who you ask. All things considered, he had a good haul of mushrooms, and the sound tapered off as he began to approach the footpaths. He told his then-wife about the, quote, whistling coyote. She said she thought that was odd. Coyotes don't whistle, she said. The incident didn't weigh heavy on his mind at all. His brain categorized the event as a slight anomaly, but nothing more. But he would think more of it a decade later, when he claims to have saw just exactly what it was that he heard. Again, Driftless was looking for morels, 10 years later, in May of 2015. It was in the afternoon, and he was on a north-facing ledge, which is important because that late in the morel season, the most hopeful locations are the colder slopes facing north. He saw some broken elm trees, bent at maybe 7 or 8 feet off the ground. He was interested in them only because morels thrive in the fallen debris of dead elm. As he descended the slope to the broken trees, he heard a shrill whistle. He went still. He hadn't heard that noise in a decade. The noise seemed to come directly from his right, perhaps behind a large honeysuckle thicket. Between him and the honeysuckle lay 75 yards of slopes, peppered with elm trees. He deftly remembered his then-wife say, "Coyotes don't whistle." He continued down the ridge to the broken elms. The slope leveled out for a bit, and Driftless decided to have a seat and drink some water before scouring the earth and leaf litter for mushrooms. He was taking in the view of it all when he suddenly heard what he described as a, quote, very loud knocking or popping sound. It seemed to have come from the bush that he had just heard the shrill whistle, that was reminiscent of the sounds of 10 years ago. Whatever it was still off to his right, but now he had given it the high ground, as he had descended down the slope past it. Again he went still, scanning the bush carefully, and again he heard the knock. He said they were sharp and staccato, and the forest was so quiet, unnaturally quiet, that he felt like he could almost feel the percussive pops hit his inner ear. He would hear 2 rapid pops of different strength, and then a second later, the same 2 rapid pops in the same order, for 7 to 10 seconds, and then silence for a minute, and then it would begin again. It took 10 minutes for him to identify the noisemaker. What he saw was only partially visible, obscured by the foliage, and it was far away, but not too far to see it clearly. He said it was jet black, and swayed slightly. He observed a foreleg, thigh, and butt. Not so much the torso, but what seemed to be a left arm. It was far away, but the longer he watched it make the sounds, he decided it was making them by swinging its left arm to strike something that it was holding in its right arm, like dry wood on stone. He believes that whatever the thing was striking with its left arm was being held stationary in its right arm. He said there's no way the honeysuckle bush would have produced that noise, as its trunk wasn't sturdy enough. Or maybe it was just somehow hitting its mouth to make the popping sounds, and it swung its arm in tandem. It was hard for him to tell. He said the pops were very strange. It would sway slightly now and then, sometimes more out of sight behind the bush, and sometimes less. As he sat there, he said it was quite a, quote, matter-of-fact moment. "Huh," he said. "This is clearly what people are talking about when they say they had a Bigfoot sighting." He professes to never have saw its face, or really make out an ear, but he would see the head for a moment as it moved. He said the left arm and shoulder was clearly man-like, and large. He couldn't see all of it, but he could see enough to know what it wasn't. In fact, he said one of its most notable details were the long strands of matted hair that spiked down off the arm. He said the hair would flutter as the arm would swing. And a bear simply doesn't have that range of motion. He said that he couldn't be certain on height because the slopes are so misleading, though interestingly enough, it was not his perception that the creature was particularly large. After watching this for almost 10 minutes, he heard from the ridge to his back a laughter or cackling sound, as he said, from what sounded like young adult human females. He said at the time he thought it was a group of girls hiking on some trail a ways away, but now he isn't so certain. Driftless asserts that the acoustics are very tricky on the innumerable ridgelines of the Driftless area. Either way, after the cackle, the creature stopped drumming and began to move off. He found it curious how it could leave silently, yet was fairly obvious when it was following him. He kept his eyes on the bush long after there was no movement. About half an hour, he said. Then all of a sudden, he realized that not having eyes on it proved far more unsettling than having eyes on it. Driftless was done hunting mushrooms for the day. Normally his path would bob and weave among the slopes, but at a moderate risk to his safety by virtue of the terrain, he cut as direct a route as he could to his car. He wasn't armed, but from this event onward, he would be. His eyes were peeled, but no longer for mushrooms. After hours and hours of conversation with Driftless, I decided that on that spring day in 2015, he either saw a chimpanzee or something else. Something often described, but still uncategorized. He would continue his hiking in and along the Driftless area, but from then on, he was prepared. Accompanied by a sidearm, mounted GoPro, and audio recorder. and that is how his channel came to be. Soon after this second encounter, he seriously injured his knee on the hills, and now can only continue on with the assistance of 2 poles. Then, of course, as soon as he began to investigate, nothing happened for over a year. Not until June of 2016. He had already been hiking for a few hours. He didn't know it at the time, but his GoPro was out of battery. It was only about a quarter of a mile from where he had his first sighting, though I assure you, a quarter of a mile is a lot more than it sounds through this terrain. He was walking parallel to a game trail. Not on the trail, but he was mirroring the path as he believes the creatures do. When he saw one on the ridge above him, he said it never looked at him. Its eyes were fixed on the ground as he saw it appear through the trees for about 4 steps. Those 4 steps were relatively unobstructed, so he saw it rather clearly until it again entered thick cover. He said it had a sloping forehead and long hair on its arms, much like his encounter the year prior. The creature walked into a row of trees and was out of sight. Driftless completely expected it to come out on the other side, but it didn't. He sat for 5 minutes. He wasn't sure if it had hunkered down or somehow slipped away. After 5 minutes of seeing and hearing nothing, he climbed the slope to investigate. He moved slowly to make sure his noise wasn't masking the creature's noise. When he got to the top, he determined that the 4 steps he saw the creature take was about 6 normal steps to him. He guessed the creature was around 7 feet tall. Once he got to where he last saw the creature enter the thicket, he saw that it could have continued forward, and it would have been seen again, or it headed straight down the steep ledge opposite from him, which it must have done as he didn't see it leave the clearing. He said the ground was too hard and leaf litter too thick to leave any prints, though he certainly looked. The strange part of this sighting is that he said it looked green. I asked what he meant by that. Driftless said it was covered in a uniform dark green. I mentioned sloths, and if maybe it could have been an algae that grows on the fur. But Driftless said it was too even for that. It was a uniform green coating, as if it had lathered or rubbed itself with something green. Maybe a natural dye of some kind. Could such a creature understand the application of camouflage? Maybe. I could not get a definitive opinion from Driftless. It was covered in something green, is all he'd say. Again, his GoPro ran out of battery about an hour before he saw this. He begrudgingly accepts that it was his own fault, but I could tell that at least part of him was skeptical and believes that some other factor may very well have been at work. He did appear quite meticulous about such things. The first time he saw one through the honeysuckle and the time he saw the walker were something. Definitively and decidedly something. He has strong suspicions now about the whistle howls, but sheepishly admits that it was, quote, either something or nothing. Like most researchers I've actually spoken with, Driftless was very careful with his wording. He has many encounters that he describes as, quote, either something or nothing. One such example of this occurred in 2018. He found a tree break. Not wedged, but rather resting on the base of the break, was a trumpet mushroom. He said it was the largest trumpet mushroom he had ever witnessed. He said that it was clearly broken at the base, not pulled, and there was no penetration of any mouth or beak or claws, and it would have been obvious. It sure seemed like it could only be the result of something with hands. To actually break the stem without leaving tooth or claw marks, and then place it in the tree, requires hands. And he was the first to say it could have been a person. He was on public land. And though signs of people are scant to non-existent, he said someone could have picked it up and then set it down, and lost it or forgot they put it there, or something like that. It certainly would have been a non-event, were it not for his previous encounters. Another occurrence that was either something or nothing was an encounter Driftless had with a deer hunter. The sun had just begun to set on an October evening, and Driftless startled a deer hunter in a blind. Driftless told me that it's surprising how few hunters he has actually encountered. The hunter told Driftless that he saw something flush some deer over a ridge, and the hunter asked Driftless if he saw anything. Driftless said that he heard some deer, but didn't see anything come down the hill. The hunter paused. Finally, he said, "I saw something come down the hill, and it wasn't a deer." All Driftless said was, "Huh." He made no mention of why he was out there, or what he'd been up to. Like he says, it was either something or nothing. But of course his first sighting was certainly something. Something decidedly ape-like. And the thing he saw made the same noise he heard following him a decade prior, when the whistling howls followed his route through the woods. And when he saw a somehow green, 7-foot-tall figure take 4 steps on a hill above him. That was certainly something. I decided regarding his first visual sighting that he either saw a chimpanzee or something else. And that something else is seen more frequently than most people like to admit. I also think he saw it again in 2016, and I think he has racked his brain so hard on the matter that he is trying to perceive meaning from it all, which is inherently tedious but entirely essential depending on the level of your dedication to the pursuit of the answers you're looking for. Driftless knows they're out there because he has seen them, and he likes his odds of getting some evidence. Obviously, I'm no human lie detector, but hours in the woods and hours along the campfire led me to a healthy level of trust. And I don't think he was being deceptive. Driftless didn't want his face out there, or his name. He isn't looking for this alleged fame and glory that so many seem to believe Bigfoot hunters are seeking. Here's another reason I don't think he is being deceptive. He now lives some 200 miles away from these forests, in an area, on paper at least, seemingly more agreeable for a cryptic creature. If he wanted to play monster hunter, why is he doing it 200 miles away from his better-suited backyard? If someone was just playing, they probably wouldn't pick a location several hours away, especially if their backyard was a more than sufficient, and perhaps even a more expected environment. There isn't much that could convince me to make that trip regularly, but seeing this would certainly do the trick. Or this. I asked if he's ever had a Bigfoot encounter up north, where he has spent more time than he has in the Driftless area. He said no, not a thing. He said you'll hear strange howls, but those are just wolves. Finding a mushroom on a tree is not terribly exciting, nor is finding tree breaks at ostensible locations. On paper, it doesn't mean a thing, unless you consider that a competent observer saw something that suggests a creature that would exhibit this behavior. He thinks they become more brazen in the morel season. I asked if maybe morel mushrooms were a preferred food resource, so they want to drive mushroom hunters away and thus have more for themselves. He said no, he didn't think so. He thinks they're more brazen in morel season because, quote, everyone's eyes are on the ground. Driftless is determined. I fundamentally believe he saw something uncategorized, and now he wants to prove it. Which makes sense to me. Every once in a while, a story hits the news about a Bigfoot hunter, and the reporters have a good laugh at the researcher's expense, and they poke fun at how crazy some people are. But that just hasn't been my experience with any of the people I've spoken with. They're not laughing about it. These are people who experienced or saw something that defies conventional explanations. They are seeing something that's been reported for centuries, and Driftless is just one of many who is trying to get to the bottom of what he witnessed with his own eyes. So feel free to check out his channel, Driftless Area Sasquatch. And for more on the Driftless Area, feel free to check out my Patreon. I'll put a link in the description. And I have a lot more to upload to YouTube with an exciting October planned. So make sure you are subscribed, and make sure that you've hit this bell recently so you receive notifications of new uploads. That helps me a lot. Anyway, and most importantly, thanks an awful lot for listening.